Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking time from your busy schedules to join us today for our next aquaculture webinar installment sponsored by the United States Aquaculture Society, the National Aquaculture Association, and the Alabama Cooperative Extension System. Today's topic is understanding feed management for shrimp and the progression from hand feeding to automated feeders. Our speaker today is Dr. Alan Davis, a professor with the Auburn University School of Fisheries, Aquaculture, and Aquatic Sciences. Dr. Davis is a noted warm water aquatic animal nutritionist that has worked with a variety of freshwater and marine species, and he focuses on the development and improvement of commercial feeds and feed management strategies. With over 250 journal articles and various other publications, including 14 book chapters and one book, Alan is clearly a busy guy, so we appreciate him spending some time with us today to share his knowledge. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Alan. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Klein. It's my pleasure to share some information with everybody. So I'd like to talk a little bit about our work that we've been doing in terms of feed management and some basics of feed management. I get a lot of questions in terms of what are the best ways to manage feed. So we'll start off with some basics, and then we'll go through some more of the modern techniques that are currently being used. So just to start off, if you think about feed programs, these are very important. In terms of costs, it's 40 to 60% of the variable costs that a farmer has. So it's a critical component that we need to optimize. And it's also the source of all our waste products. So if we're having to run a RAS system, if we're having to do aeration, if we're having to do water exchanges, all the pollutants are coming from the feed. So it's very important that we manage this. Now, one interesting thing about feed management is quite often feeds are paid by what I'll say is a low or lower paid worker. And that's kind of scary because you're taking your biggest variable cost and you're handing it off to somebody who's not really paid that much. And I don't think you do that with your retirement income or some other large amount of money. But we do that all the time in aquaculture. So those people need to be very highly trained. Now, they may not be making the most money at the facility, but they need to be highly trained because they're linking you, the feed management, and the animal all together. And so it's very important that they know what they're doing and they're very well trained. And quite often in aquaculture, we want to increase production. Well, reality is, if you start looking at it, increasing production doesn't mean you make more money. You may actually lose money when you do that. So to me, if you're going to use some incentives for your employees to improve things, it should be based on efficiency, not purely producing more animals, because producing more animals faster may actually cost you more money or give you more risk associated with your production. So keep that to efficiencies. Again, it's to improve the economic returns on your feed management to the farm. That's what the real goal is. Now, to me, I'm a big proponent of continuous management, continual improvement. So I think we need to be looking at the things that we do all of the time. So that means if we want to improve our feed management, we need to understand the basics. And we need to understand how to collect data and then how to improve things. And so it's a process that you go through. So I'm going to start off with just reminding you of a few basic things just to make sure we're all on the same page. And then we'll move to more current projects with feed management. But remember, nutrition and feed management go hand in hand. They're linked, okay? So the diet is completely worthless unless you properly apply it. If the person takes the feed and pours it on the side of the bank, didn't do the fish any good. Also, if you have a wonderful application process for your feed, but the diet is bad, it's not nutritionally adequate, it's rancid, it has issues, well, you're not going to get results from that either. So both of them have to be linked together. If that feed is not consumed, if that feed is not utilized to the best of the ability of the animals, it's really expensive fertilizer. It's a lot cheaper to go buy fertilizer than it is to go buy feed. And we want that feed to be used for the animal to grow, not simply as fertilizer for natural productivity. So just a few other reminders in terms of feeding programs. I'm a big believer. I can't tell you how to feed your animals, your fish or your shrimp, okay? I can give you tools. I can help you understand how to manage it. But the site-specific conditions, the environment that is there, the genetics, those are going to trump any nutrition. So it's very critical that you realize that you can't just go to a book off the shelf and find a feed management program. You can find the concepts and you can apply them, but the answers aren't there because the genetics, the environmental conditions are all different for all the ponds, for all the different farms, for all the different countries, for all the different places, okay? And I think it's also very critical that we look at our historical results. So you have what is typical growth rates that you should be targeting. You have a season that may be rainy, a season that may be dry, a season that may be hot, a season that may be cold. You have a season when different diseases come in, all right? We know when those things are happening. We want to anticipate those changes and make sure that we're managing in advance, not in response. Anybody who's managing as a response to a disaster is having a lot of problems. You need to manage in anticipation of a disaster. You need to anticipate what needs to be happening because that gives you better returns on your investments. And we all have to learn from our mistakes. We make mistakes all the time. Need to go back and find the root cause of why that mistake occurred and fix it, okay? Not simply just say, it happened, let's move on, all right? Now, one of the first choices, whether or not you really realize it or not, is whether or not we're using natural productivity or some of the food sources that we're using. Many producers view natural productivity as a problem, not a resource. I have all these pollution that went into my pond, it caused algae to grow, I need to get rid of it, okay? Well, that algae is the base of a food chain. If we're dealing with carp, tilapia, shrimp, any animal that can use that natural productivity, it's a benefit for us to have it in the system and to use it. So if you look at feed, conversion efficiencies, growth rates, performance of farms, those that have single pass systems, they're just pushing water through, they're never going to have the feed conversions that you will on other types. If we're using aeration to manage, what we're doing is we're keeping that natural productivity in the system, and we're using aeration to maintain our dissolved oxygens, but we're increasing available food for those animals. The same thing with recycle systems. A lot of our farms, in terms of large pond systems, they're recycling water within the farm. There's a couple of reasons for that. Diseases, the water quality may be actually better on the farm than it is off the farm, but also that retains natural foods within the system, and we can have an enhancement of performance. So I'm a big believer that if the animal is going to use natural foods, we want to embrace that and use technologies that promote that use. There's lots of data out there for shrimp, and that's what we're talking about primarily today in terms of shrimp and natural productivity. And all the studies say somewhere between 40 and maybe even as high as 60% of the carbon can come from natural productivity if you allow the animals to use it. Now, this is an example where we're talking about 150 shrimp per meter. So this is an intensive biofloc system. And most people say as you intensify, you lose natural productivity. And that's not true with a lot of our species, especially with shrimp. So this is a bacterial-driven community that's doing our water quality. So it's a dirty, biofloc type system. And what we did is we fed different rations. So we went from our full ration and backed off down to about 30% of that ration. And what that allows us to do is backwards regress what the contribution of natural productivity is when we're feeding a system, because this is a common system that we used. And in this case, we grew the shrimp up to about 12 grams, and about 3.4 grams of that came from natural productivity. So about 26% of the growth of those animals came from natural productivity when I allow them to use it. Now, one of the challenges when you're dealing with wanting your animals to use natural productivity is that animals aren't stupid. If there is plenty of food around, they're not going to get off the couch essentially to go find anything. If you're throwing food into a system all the time in excess, those animals are never going to go out and look for food. You do have to keep your animals a little bit hungry. They have to have a reason to go out and use that natural productivity. But if you do restrict the feed a little bit, you're then accessing that natural productivity and you're improving your performance of your animals and reducing your feed conversion on your farm. And that's a big economic benefit. Now, we need to think a little bit about how shrimp grow, how shrimp eat before we talk about feed management. And to be honest with you, I don't know if it's the food being nutritious causing growth, or if it's the growth causing the animal to be hungry and go get more food. But these two things are interrelated, whether or not they're eating more and growing faster, or they're growing faster, therefore they're eating more. Don't know which one comes first. It's the chicken or the egg. But we do know that we can understand how these animals consume feed, and then we're going to be able to improve our feed management. So let's dive in, so to speak, and see what shrimp actually do. We had an opportunity that we had a fairly clear pond. So what did we do? We dropped the camera down there just to show what happens when feed is thrown into a pond. And you can see threw some feed in there, and very quickly, there was only 1 or 2 shrimp on camera. And now you've got 8 or 10, and they just start coming in, and you get a very dense group of shrimp. They come to that feed to get that food. Now, if we take a little closer look, these are some shrimp in an aquarium, and there's an excess of food here, but look at these guys. They're little pigs. They pick up 8, maybe 4 or 5 pieces, drop 3 of them, pick up some more, drop them, pick them back up. They're very messy eaters, and they're really messy when there's lots of food around, because they'll pick it up, they'll see more food, they'll end up grabbing another piece of food, and they'll drop what's in there. And so they're continually grabbing food, dropping it if there's plenty of food around there. Now, if you restrict the amount of food, of course, they're going to grab it, they're going to hold on to it because they don't see any food laying around that they're going to exchange that with. But they're messy eaters. They're also very slow eaters. Long time ago, we did where we gave feed over time. So, of course, no feed all the way up to about 360 minutes worth of time. And then we simply went in at different time periods and quantified how much food was being consumed. And this is quite interesting, because if you think about it, quite often people feed once or twice a day. Well, if I feed once a day, and I'm actually giving a bigger time range than I think the food is really available for, I'm given 90 minutes, probably only really available for maybe 60 minutes. But you can see that's all that they're going to consume, and you missed out on the consumption for the rest of the day. Now, if you give them 2 feedings, well, you get a little bit better. But the idea is we want to have food available all the time so that they can consume it, and that will get you your maximum feed intake. Because they go out and eat these very small meals, then they'll rest a little bit, then they'll go get some more food and eat another small meal. They're not like a fish. They do not eat a large meal and then have it slowly digested. It only takes about 15 or 20 minutes for a shrimp to digest that food. So he's going to consume it, he's going to digest it, and then he's going to go get more meals. So another part of this puzzle is what happens with leaching. So we've actually went and fed shrimp leached feed. So we put the feed in the water for a given amount of time, and then we fed it to the shrimp to see what their growth rate is. And if you look, if you leach feed for maybe 30 minutes, there's absolutely no difference in terms of growth rates of the shrimp. But as we took that feed and leached it longer and longer, the growth rate decreased, okay? So feed that's been in the water is probably not real good for these animals. They're not getting the nutrition, and that's probably because of leaching. And so I think, I call this the soggy cereal effect. And if you've ever eaten cereal, you put it in the bowl, you put your milk in there, and it's real good right there when you start eating it. But if you wait 5 or 10 minutes, it gets soggy. It's no longer as nice, okay? So like in this bowl, this is kind of a cool example, is you just swish off a little bit of cereal. It's not in the milk very long. You can eat it while it's crunchy, and you just swish some more off. That's what we need to do with shrimp. Give them lots of small feedings into the water so that we don't lose the nutrients. Now, this is a little bit complicated graph. We've done a lot of things with recordings. Silvio from Brazil has done a lot of work with us, and this is an example of doing recordings in some aquariums right here on the right-hand side. And there's a lot of different ways we can look at this data, but this is just a quick example. And what this is we've broken down the amount of energy that's created by a clicking noise that the shrimp make. And this is essentially how much food is being consumed. But what I want to point out here is that if you look at just the first, less than 15 minutes, that was 80% of the feed intake. The remaining 20 was done over the next, 15 or 20 minutes. And so really they're going in there, they're grabbing food very quickly. They're consuming it over a relatively short period of time. So they got that big intake, and then they drop down and maybe they eat a little bit for a little while, and then they're going to take and have another big meal. So again, indicates that we need to have our food there on a regular basis, and they need access to it to get the best results. So this is another example of some work where we're looking at a standard feeding rate. So along the x-axis is percentage that we're feeding them, and we're always redialing in our feed management. But this shows a good example of what happens, and I'll show you a couple. But at very low feed rates, of course, they're not growing as fast as they do at higher feed rates. But as you come up in the feed rate, you come up to some sort of plateau. All right, so there's a plateau right in here where our weight gain was pretty equivalent. And then once you go beyond that, actually you trashed out the system. You're overfeeding so much that you can't manage that. You get organic buildup, and actually you have a decrease. If you look at feed conversions, the same thing happens. You start off with a very good feed conversion, and as you add more feed to get faster growth, the feed conversion gets worse, and at some point in time, you cross a line, and then that feed conversion really jumps up. And that is because of the overfeeding. Now, here's another example. In this particular case, we looked at the contribution of natural productivity, but doing the same thing. So just to show you that, at low feed inputs right here, the natural productivity, this is our apparent net protein retention of our animals. So how much the protein in the feed was retained by the animals, and it's an amazing 60%. Well, we calculated what was contributed by natural productivity using regression analysis. And really, you can back out how much was coming from natural productivity. And that gives us this number, and this number comes all the way across to all of our feed managements, and that's what would be absorbed from the diet. So the difference between this and this is the contribution of natural productivity. And as you can see, that contribution comes down as your feed rate goes up, right? And we saw that the feed conversion goes up. Why does the feed conversion go up? There's less natural productivity, but even at our maximum feed rates, we're still getting about 20 to 25% of the contribution of food coming from that natural productivity, but it's less. So again, another reason to not feed at maximum rates, because you're going to maximize the contribution of natural productivity, and you're going to have better feed conversions, and that risk of overfeeding is not going to be as easy to occur. Okay, so it's a good thing to minimize things. Now let's start talking just a little bit about traditional feed management and some of the techniques that we would use. So I call most of this feed management is observation. So for example, we can use feed trays. And I'll show you some example of feed trays. Put the feed out there on the feed trays, partial or all of it. We can use pre-programmed tables. So for example, a feed table, or in our case, we do regression analysis, we can do some predictions, but these could be published numbers or they could be in-house. And then in reality, I honestly think that a lot of farmers actually go to a tarot card reader or use a magic crystal ball or call a hotline, because I don't know how they're doing their management. They just making a guess, I guess. But most people, when they're good feed managers, they actually use a combination of things. But let's look a little bit very quickly at some of these management techniques. So the first one, if we look at feeding trays, doesn't really matter if you put part of the feed on there or you put all the feed on there. This is very labor intensive. It does work well for a lot of people. So it is a good management technique. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of farms that use feed trays, use them very successfully, okay? The problem I have is that the feed response is variable, varies from day to day, tray to tray. The person who's managing the trays, as well as how well they manage the trays. So think about it. If you pour food on one of these trays and dump it when you're putting it down, or dump it when you're picking it up, you have a false reading. You also saw in the recordings, I showed you in the aquarium, those shrimp would pick up 5 or 6 pieces of feed, and then they dropped a lot of them. So those shrimp may be picking that feed up off the tray, swimming off, dropping it, and then simply returning to the tray, grabbing more feed, and then swimming off. So just because it's not on the tray does not mean it was consumed, okay? And so we get these false results from them. So these results may be misleading. But again, in my book, if it wasn't so labor intensive, it is a good management tool. But again, I'm cheap. I don't want to pay for the labor. So there's lots of questions about the use of trays. How big should they be? How many should there be per pond? You know, should you put part or all of the feed, et cetera? There's lots of different questions. And you can see in this example, they are having all the feed on all the trays. And you can see this is going to take you a long time to fill those trays, drop them down, and then come back and check those trays. Now we can also, put part of the feed out on the trays and part of the feed by some other mechanism. And most of the studies that have been looked at in terms of using feed trays, they've recommended not to put all the feed on the feed trays because it leads to organic matter buildup around those trays. Also, the more trays you have, the more labor it's going to cost you in terms of managing those trays. One of the biggest disadvantages of using feed trays is that you would have to have an incredible amount of labor to try and manage them. It's just not cost effective. You might get up to 4 feedings per day, but the labor required to do that is very large. So a lot of people will use feed trays as a management tool and then broadcast the feed, whether or not you're using a hand feeding or you're using an automatic feeder. So on the right-hand side, you can see some feed being dispersed with an automatic blower. On the left-hand side, you can see we've got a person doing it by hand. And watch this video because I find it interesting. When he backswings, he dumps about half of what he's throwing out. So, the objective of doing this by hand is we want to distribute the feed over a large area. Yet on his back, when he starts, he dumped out about half the feed. So again, if you're going to do things, you need to make sure that the techniques are good and that we are spreading things out as best as we can. Now, if I had to feed a couple 1,000 pounds of feed, I probably would spill things just like this person is doing. But the idea is to spread it out, not to make piles. And what they're basically doing is making piles. Now, a lot of people will also use feed tables. And again, feed tables are commonly used. We've got some regression that you can convert to a feed table that I'll show you here later on. And they're used by a lot of people. They're used by fish. They're used by shrimp guys. Some of them are put out by the feed manufacturers. Some of them are by the farmers. But remember, quite often these feed tables don't dictate what type of feed. They don't dictate the temperature. And we know that the animals are going to grow differently with different types of feed. We know they're going to grow differently at different temperatures. And so those specifications are quite often not there. Also, the animals typically don't read these, and so they don't really know what they're supposed to do. So these feed tables, they are good. They're a good management tool. If you work with them and continually refine them, they are a good way to deal with things. It's very easy to find out the size of a shrimp or a fish to then go to a feed table. That part's relatively easy, but determining the biomass, what's your survival for your shrimp? That's a lot harder to figure out. And so it makes it difficult to use a feed table if you really don't know what your biomass is or the survival of your animals. So again, it's a good way to manage things, but be careful with them. And here's a good example. Literally, I was in the back of a taxi in Vietnam, and clearly I was bored, but I like to occasionally pick up feed tables from different places and look at them. So this was in the taxi and I had a long drive, so I started looking at them. I took a picture to show people later on. What I typically do when I look at feed tables, I usually don't, I do care, but I typically don't look at the very start of small animals because your investment is relatively small. It's a very high dollar feed, but in terms of your feed bill, it's relatively small. When you get to, after about a quarter of your production, so that last half or the last 3 quarters, that's where the money is. Okay, so that's usually where I start looking at feed management. So in this example, I'll give you I picked out a 12-gram shrimp, looked up on the table what they recommended, and they recommended 3% of the body weight. And this is a 38% protein diet in this example. Now, at that particular time in Asia, they were getting, somewhere between 1 and maybe 1.2 grams, just over 1 gram of growth per week. So I took my 12-gram shrimp, I took my 3% body weight, that's 0.36 grams per day, or if you think about it on a weekly basis, that's 2.5 grams per week. Well, if you start calculating feed conversions based on theoretical growth, you can see that what was typical feed conversion or growth rates at that time would result in a really bad feed conversion. Matter of fact, to get where I consider the feed conversion good, they needed about 2 grams per week of growth. And at that point in time, they were not close to it. So what I oftentimes do is use feed conversion or theoretical feed conversion as a basis to judge if we're in the right or wrong spot for feeding it. It's not the absolute answer, but it's a good way to look at things. And so I think that looking at short-term feed conversions is a good way to look at whether or not we think we're doing a good job managing. You don't know until you actually harvest your animals, but at least you can think about it at that point in time. So you do have to come up with some sort of survival. If you aren't very good or you don't have real reliable numbers for survival, you can use an average survival at your facility. But what I typically like to do is take a 2-week interval. I don't like using 1 week because growth with shrimp is often a little bit variable. And so we'll take a 2-week window and do it at different places during the production cycle and look at what the growth was between those 2-week period or over that 2-week period, how much feed was put in over that 2-week period, and what we think the survival is. And you can calculate the theoretical feed conversion. And then we use that as a judgment. Hey, this feed conversion is 2 to 1. We're doing something wrong. We need to reevaluate. Is our survival really high? Or are we simply overfeeding? Okay, but it gives you a number that you can judge. And what I typically say is that, if you have feed conversions over 1.4 on a commercial basis in shrimp, you probably can work on your feed management. There's probably things wrong that we can optimize. Okay, now maybe you have survival issues, in which case all bets are off for feed conversion. But if you have, good survivals or reasonable survivals, and you're over a 1.4 in terms of feed conversion, then need to look at improving things. If you're in that range of 1.2 to 1.4, you got pretty good feed management. Now, still, there may be some things to optimize, and you want to look at that. And then, of course, if you're at 1.2 or less, I say you're doing a great job. Let's talk about what you're doing, because I'd also like to learn how people manage. Now, quite often when I tell farmers that you need to be below 1.4, they tell me, oh, there's no way, we can't do that. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. And so what I tell them to do is start looking at all their data and go in and find the examples of really good production that they had and really low feed conversion. Because if I can find a pond on their farm that has a feed conversion at 1.2, that demonstrates that it's quite reasonable to do that. Okay. So what you should be doing is looking, where is my best feed conversions? And then start asking, why did that happen? And that should be the goal, to try and get all my feed conversions down there. And of course, if you reach that point, we're going to change where the goal is, and we're going to try and do better. But you should be able to get your feed conversions down, especially if you're above that 1.4 or 1.5. There's a lot of things you can do to improve that. Now, as I said, there's different ways to look at feed management, and there's what I'll consider the things that we've been doing in the past and the things that we're moving towards in the future. And if you look at all the feed management that I've talked about so far, what I call traditional feed management, there's a lot of people who do this very well, and you can get good results. Remember, record keeping is critical. No one method works. So the people who are good at feed management use many different ways to look at their feed management. So they might have feed trays out there. They're going to look at their average feed conversions. They're going to look at gut fill. They're going to use as many different things as they can, growth rates compared to historical growth rates, to manage their data, but they're actively managing it, okay? But again, you got to have quality data. You need to know how many animals you stocked. And quite often people don't quantify that well. Not, oops, they gave me 20% in overage. That's not a true number. We need to know the truth about what was stocked. We need to know what our survivals are. We need to know how much food's being put in there, okay? But if you look at using traditional management, whether or not using blowers, using hand spreading, you're using all of your feed on a feed tray or part of your feed on a feed tray, these are all labor intensive. And the reality is the most you can get is maybe 4 feedings per day. No matter what you're doing, if you're doing these techniques, the more feedings per day you can do, the better off you're going to be, okay? So if you are using all your feed, let's say on feed trays, my recommendation is get rid of half the feed trays, spread a lot of that feed out. You can still use the feed trays for management, but anything that you can do to increase the number of feedings, even if that means feeding less area of the pond, we don't have to cover the entire pond, okay? But increase the number of feedings, you're going to get improvements in performance of those animals. So the problem I have with all of these things we've talked about is they're what I would call post-responsive, all right? You went out, you put your feed out there, some hours later, you got a response, or maybe even a day or 2 days, or sometimes a week later, then you looked at your feed management and you made a decision, okay? The way I describe it is it's kind of like going to the doctor after you died. It's a bit late, all right? You want to go to the doctor as you're just starting to get sick, because then they can do something. And a lot of these feed management techniques that we used historically are really trying to correct a problem after it's already occurred. You've already thrown the food out there. It's already not been eaten. Now you're making a decision on what's going to happen in the future. And you can't really predict what's going on in the future. But if you look at, what goes on in fish and in other species, you do find that we can get to optimization of feed inputs based on real-time responses. Okay, we can't predict the future, but we can look at what's going on right now, and we can adjust very quickly. Okay, not instantaneously, but we can respond very quickly. And that really has allowed a lot of people to improve their feed conversions and to match inputs with the needs of the animals. So if you look at fish, on-demand feeding, I don't think we're going to go here and hand feed all our animals. And here it's very obvious on the right-hand side, using a floating feed, you can see what the response of the fish is. And the reality is these are fish that are on, you can see there's an automatic feeder there. So we're actually giving them more feed. They've already been fed. So what I like to get the best feed management, and this is a good example, is you want to keep your animals hungry. Because if they're hungry, they always come to the food and you lose less feed. Anytime you overfeed, you're losing money, okay? You may sacrifice a little bit of growth, but you're going to gain it in feed conversion and, in my opinion, economic efficiencies. So this is with fish. It's a little harder to see what's going on with the shrimp. So Silvio's up here on the right-hand side. He was in my lab for a while, and he's done a whole lot of work in terms of looking at acoustics with shrimp. Now, you may not be able to hear the response, but right here, you're going to see a click. One will be coming, and then you see the mandibles. Okay, so Silvio synchronized these, and the click may not be coming across for Zoom, but there's a distinct click whenever they take a bite, okay? And that, there's been a lot of work that shows that the energy that's produced from that, or the noise, or the number of clicks, however you want to look at it, is directly related to the consumption of the animals. And so these clicks are at a specific frequency that can be recorded. And so what we have now is software that listens for these clicks, and then it allows us to real-time adjust to the amount of food the shrimp want to consume. So here's an example, and this has been done from very extensive systems to very intensive systems. This is an example of a very intensive shrimp system where they're at 100 shrimp per meter. These are 15-gram shrimp that were done, and then we have recordings. And again, the recordings may not come through, but I will click through them to see what happens. But you can see visually, this is the noise coming from an aerator. And then once you feed, this is the noise coming from the feed. And I will click on this and see if I can get this to roll. Oh, let me back up. See if I can get this to, and maybe I'm not going to be able to get it to roll. Anyways, you can visually see what's going on, but you do have to screen out some background noises and then look for this. But the software can very easily measure this response, okay? And this is a neat tool because we can use it in feed management, but we can also help predict populations. We can see molting activities. When there's poor water quality, the animals are going off feed quite often. So we can see these things going on in real time. You know, if you look at a feed tray, that's what happened an hour ago, right? When you picked it up. When you go to an acoustic feeder, that's recording what's going on right now, and it's adjusting over just a few minutes, not a few hours or a few days. And so it's really nice in terms of using this acoustics to manage our animals. And the way it works, very simply, and maybe you can hear in the background, so it kind of sounds like rain on a tin roof, or you're frying something. But you can hear that at the very beginning, the noise is very low. Now the noise is very low. So the feeder, when the feed goes in there, the shrimp respond, and you can hear that. And that's shown here in these graphics. So what this little blue line or green line right here is a feeder throwing a test feed. So it just spins really quickly, throws some feed out there, and then you get a very nice response from the shrimp. It goes up very quickly and comes down very quickly. So that means there's shrimp there, they're hungry. So the feeder hears that, says, hey, I'm going to go into some cycling of feeding. And it's using data from the previous feeding when it starts up. But it's going to throw out feed based on what it thinks needs to happen based on previous feedings. And it's going to listen to that response. So you should get a fast response, and then it should come down. And it does. Well, then it spins and throws again, listens for the response, and it goes down. But now this response is dropping off. It's not going up as fast, and it's not coming down as fast, and it's not going as high. That means, hey, there's must be too much feed around. We need to slow down how much food is going in. So as you can see, this next spin right here, it's not for as long as the previous spins because the software is interpreting the noise produced as lower feed rate. Consequently, it runs for some time, and then the animals start hitting the feed harder. They start making more noise. It comes up hard and comes down hard. So software says, hey, there's a lot more shrimp around here now that are consuming feed. We need to feed more. So what does it do? It spins longer, and then it goes on. Now, in this particular case, this is, I think, a 30-minute cycle. There's lots of controls on these feeders that you can manipulate this with, but you're going to feed for a given period of time, then go into a rest mode. Shut the feeding down because you want them to come in, clean off the plate, so to speak, clean up all the extra food, and then reinitiate the feeding cycle. And within these various softwares that people have for this, you can change how long that cycling is. You can change how what we call the aggressiveness of feeding based on a given sound response. You're going to feed longer or you're going to feed shorter, depending on what's happening. So through some controls, we can manipulate to a certain degree what the feeder is interpreting. But this gives us the opportunity to actually feed on demand for our shrimp. And so we've done a lot of work looking at, basic feed management versus the acoustic feed management. I'm going to show you a little bit of that data in terms of performance. Now, a lot of times, a lot of these are being done with research diets. So we've had Ziegler produce open feed formulations. So we have lots of examples of different formulations that we've used, but we're continually trying to improve things. And that's the key, is that we're not standing still with our feed management. We're continually looking at it and saying, how can we improve? I'm going to take you through a little bit of that in terms of using the acoustic on-demand feeders. So just to give you an overview, if you look holistically at our hand management, this is what I considered as good management using 2 feedings per day, traditional hand management. We ran about 4,500 kilos per hectare. We get up to about a 25, 26 gram shrimp. Of course, we have very good feed conversions because we're conservative on our feed. We ran 110 to 120 day cycle. When we move to automated systems where we're feeding a lot more feedings, whether or not it's a timer-based feeder or an acoustic-based feeder, we jumped in terms of performance. So we essentially cut 30 days off of production and produced more shrimp and a higher biomass. So we then got up to about 700 kilos or 7,000 kilos per hectare, 32 gram shrimp, still have a 1-to-1 feed conversion, and we're in 90 days. So essentially we took off 20 to 30 days off our production cycle, produced more shrimp, and maintained size, or actually got bigger in terms of size. So the use of automatic feeders or acoustic feeders has a great deal of potential. So let's go through and give you some examples. Now, I've skipped a couple of years of transition, but our reference right here in terms of what I'm telling you we're feeding, this is in reference to an optimized 2 feedings per day feed management, okay? So we're using that as a reference. So right now we're already at 130 to 160% of what we used to do, okay? And what we've been doing is looking at the optimization of timer feeders and then looking at the efficacies of the acoustics at the same time. So just to show you what our feed management looks like, basically we're feeding a crumbled or a very small pellet here initially and ramping up to where our maximum rates are. And then we have pre-programming of our feed inputs with some minor adjustments as we're flying. But you can see we're at about 70 to 90 kilos per hectare per day in terms of our feed rates, but we come up and then we're running. And so the objective of this was to look at what happened in terms of that performance. And you can see as we increased the amount of feed, we got bigger animals. Survivals are pretty much the same. We got higher yields, and we still have very good feed conversions. But if you look at the AQ1, which is acoustically managing the feed, and we're letting it, we do modify the controls, okay? So it doesn't do just anything at once, but it's making the decisions within the control parameters that we've given it. Well, it did better than we did. And this was after we've already optimized our automatic feeders for a couple of years. We're still moving, trying to that AQ1. But 32 grams, and again, still got very good feed conversions because we're still being very conservative. And so one of the reasons we did this is we wanted to combine the data to make a new feed curve. So we look at this data and you see the growth. We start off with our feeders, and up to about here, we then see that the 130 and the 145 fall off. So they're not getting as much feed. When we get to here, our 160 is doing good, but then of course it falls off, and our AQ1 automatic feeding system does the best. But what we've been able to do is go from hand feeding and then sequentially using timer feeders. We've changed our feed management and basically, building new feed curves for automatic feeders. And if you take this data and take where we're not overfeeding, you can actually build out a feed curve. And to me, a feed table is basically this. It's a curve, and you solve for that curve because this is the quantities of feed at different times that we've fed. We can back calculate that and create a table. Now, reason we did this is we wanted to combine and see where if we could better optimize our feed management for our timer-based feeders, okay? And so that's what we did. We combined those 3 feed management strategies. So we come up to here, we're at our 130, but then we went ahead and went up to 140, then we went up to 160. And so if you'll notice, when we started off, we're only down here in the 60, maybe 80 kilos per hectare is our top of our feed management. Well, after using these automatic feeders and building things out, we're now to 160% of our traditional feed management using 2 hand feedings per day, which was optimized. And so since we now have this new feed management system and we have automatic feeders, we wanted to look at what happens during the day, or if we feed only at night, or if we feed 24 hours a day. And so that's what we did. We fed only during the day, the exact same amount of food, exact same number of feedings. Then we fed at night, again, the same number of feedings, same amount of feed. And then we fed 24 hours a day. So in this case, we have to spread out the feed, but same amount of feed, same number of feedings, just over a 24-hour period. And then again, we ran the acoustic system as comparison. Now, this is, the response after about 5 years of optimizing automatic feeders. So let's see what the results are. So again, we got very good performance with these 3 feeding strategies, day, night, and 24 hours, but there's really no difference in performance when we fed during the day, when we fed at night, or when we fed for 24 hours. Feed conversion, production, growth rates are all pretty much identical. So to me, quite often people ask, can I feed at night? My answer is yes, you can feed at night. I don't recommend it. I'll explain that in a minute. Now, of course, the AQ1 system, we still, after 5 years, have not matched the AQ1 system, okay? Growth rates are still better, survival's in line, but our weekly growth rates, we used to think an average of 1 or 1.2 was good. We're now up to 2.2 grams per week. Yields are up to 8,000 kilos per hectare, and we still have very good feed conversions. So we've actually ended up giving up on timer feeders and have switched everything to the AQ1. Now, just doing some very quick math, this is not a full budget. This is just feed, electrical, PL cost, a few of the costs thrown in there, just to see what the costs were. And what we've noticed, and this makes sense, when we fed during the day, our electrical cost was a lot lower than when we fed 24 hours a day or when we fed at night, okay? So what does that tell you? Well, if you think about it, when you're feeding at night, that's when you got to run your aeration the most because oxygen is limiting. And you're now adding something that has to be oxidized. So you're increasing the load at night for your aeration. So as far as I'm concerned, we should not be feeding at night. From midnight to 6-ish in the morning, I recommend don't feed. And the reason is, can you do it? Of course you can do it, especially if you have good aeration. But it's costing you more in aeration. And we didn't see any difference between feeding during the day or feeding at night or feeding for 24 hours, okay? So if you limit the feed time, it makes sense for me to limit it at nighttime when my oxygen stress is the worst. And that's my recommendation, and that's my justification for doing so. You can make your own decision. Now, as I said, we then switched the whole facility over to AQ1 management. So we're using acoustics in all of our ponds now. And that allows us to do a lot of neat things, to look at whether or not this free choice of the shrimp actually does work and what are some of the constraints of it. So one of the first trials we looked at, because everybody knows that a plant-based diet is not very good tasting. Shrimp don't like to eat it. And that we need to have animal protein in our feeds. Well, we ran a plant-based diet, 8% poultry meal, 8% fish meal, and 12% fish meal. And of course, everybody knows the more fish meal you put in a diet, the better off you are. So we did this using the AQ1, and that's allowing the shrimp to make a decision on how much. We're not controlling the feed, the shrimp are controlling the feed. So let's see what happened. Well, look, grams per week is pretty much identical. Yields are pretty much identical. There's no statistical difference against any of this. Feed's the same. Feed conversions were not quite as good as they have been in the past, but we had very good survivals. And one interesting thing, if you look at feed costs, and quite often, I'm a proponent of plant-based diets. I mean, that's what I'm working towards. But the reality in a commercial situation, and this shows it, that having somewhere between 6 or 8% of an animal protein in the diet actually allows you to have a cheaper feed. And it's shown here, the dollars per kilogram for our feed costs, having 8% poultry meal or some animal-based protein actually reduced the cost. Now, of course, if you're using a high dollar animal protein such as fish meal, that of course drove the cost back up. And of course, the more fish meal you have, the higher the cost of the feed. But we did not see differences in performance across a plant-based diet or a poultry-based diet or fish meal-based feed formulations. And that's with the animals making their choice. So we've done a lot more work with this. We also looked at plant-based diets, and we've ran probably 10 or 15 years where we had plant-based diets. We know that, what I say is 95% of the time we can get the same performance, but not always. And we know that, krill meal, we know that squid meals, we know that fish hydrolysates are really good attractants, and a lot of people like to use them. So because we have the acoustics, we have the opportunity to evaluate this under field conditions, and that's exactly what we did. So we ran our trials using the AQ1. And if you look at the growth rates, I mean, we can tease a little bit out of here, but pretty much they're on top of each other for the whole production season. If you look at our production, we did get a little bit lower performance in the all plant-based diet. And this is that 5% of the time where things don't necessarily work. But we did get higher performance when we added the krill, the squid, or the fish hydrolysates. And it's actually interesting, when we added the fish hydrolysates, we actually had more feed going into the system. And we think that is because there was actually more clicking, or the shrimp were being more aggressive. And so it does look like that the feeder does respond to that, okay? But again, that ended up with a little bit of overfeeding, and you can see that our feed conversions are not as good as we would like them to be. But again, realize that with AQ1, there are settings that you have to change. And so if you find that a feed is causing a louder noise for whatever reason, you can dial back the aggressiveness. You can dial back how it interprets those signals. Realize that these automatic systems, it's not just a black box you go stick out there. It's a black box that has some controls, and you have to manipulate those controls to get your best results. But again, we saw that, having these hydrolysates or these attractants in the feed formulations did give a little bit different response of the shrimp. And to look at the feed inputs, you can see that the plant-based diet was the lowest, and then of course the fish hydrolysate is the highest, but that higher feed intake did not really translate into a higher performance or bigger biomass for those animals. So, in terms of a take-home message, and to try and wrap this nice presentation up, we've used a lot of different feed formulations for shrimp, and fish meal diets diets that are free of fish meal, if they're properly formulated, they work great. Diet does not have to have fish meal in it. It does have to be formulated correctly. We have worked a lot with what I call post-management responses, trying to look at management using feed trays, using other mechanisms. And the take home is the more feedings you can do, the better off you're going to be. So, for example, if you're using feed trays, and I have this conversation with farmers all the time. Oh, I can't use it would cost me more labor to do more feedings. Well, the reality is it usually doesn't. You can figure out how to use the same labor, just use it differently. Quite often that means feeding less surface area, or in many cases, they find the workers really just aren't working most of the time, that they're not active all the time. And so going to more feedings, you just get more work, so to speak, out of your workers. But whatever you can do to increase the number of feedings for shrimp, that's really going to benefit you. Assuming that you are not overfeeding, that's assuming you have good genetics, that's assuming you have good water quality. All things work together. But if you have good genetics, if you have good water quality, good management on that farm, increasing the number of feedings typically will get faster growth rates, allow you to get more feed into the system, and get better performance. Timer-based feeders, that's a great option. That's an easy way to increase the number of feedings. But again, you still have to manage these. And again, you're managing with post-management. So you're managing an hour, 2 hours, or maybe even a day or 2 days later on trying to interpret what feed management is. To me, the best that we've seen in terms of returns on your investment, in terms of performance of the animals, is to use some sort of passive acoustic system where you have direct feedback, a real-time response by the shrimp. And if you want to give it as a global average, most farms see about a 25% increase in performance. Now, one thing I do warn people about, if you're really good at feed management, you're not going to see a change in feed conversion when you go to an automatic timer feeder, or you use AQ1 or some sort of passive acoustic system. because you already were managing your feed very well. But you will get more feed into the system, which means you get higher growth rates. Now, there's a lot of different types of feeders out there. There's different acoustic feeders. There's 3 or 4 different companies producing acoustic feeders now. Timer-based feeders, there's a lot of different companies out there. These can be configured where they're drawing off an electric grid, but there's also a lot of solar-powered examples. So here's an example using solar power to run the systems. No matter what feeder you want to choose, they're going to have some specification. And all these feeders do feed a little bit differently. Basically it goes back to how big a circle are you throwing feed to, okay? How far do these spread it out? What's the surface area of that feeding area? But all the feeders companies should have some general recommendations on how many feeders per hectare, or how many shrimp per feeder, or how many kilos of feed a feeder is capable of putting out per day, which you can then use to gauge how many feeders you need in terms of a system. And you do not want too many feeders, because then you spread the feed out too much and you don't get a good signal if you're using acoustics. And if you have too few of feeders, you can have too many shrimp at the feeder. And again, so there are some rules of thumb and some adjustments that you should do. But if you think you got too many shrimp at a feeder and they're not growing as well, add another feeder. Or if you don't have a good enough signal, you take away a feeder, and that brings more shrimp to where you're getting your signal. So there's a lot of tricks that you can do. As some final reminders, what the automation allows you to do is increase feed inputs. And if you increase your feed input, that means you increase the pollution going into your system, okay? Feed inputs and water quality are directly linked. The amount of aeration you need in a system is directly related, not to biomass that you have, but the quantity of feed that goes into the system, okay? So as you add more feed into a system, you have to change how you're managing your system. You may have to add more aeration, or you may have to back off on your densities to allow more feed per shrimp to go. That's what we've done at our facility. We have a fixed amount of aeration that we can run. So we've essentially backed off on our densities, allowed the shrimp to grow faster, gotten more feed to individual shrimp. We've actually ended up with higher biomasses. Also, as you transition from your traditional feed management to automatic feeders or to acoustic feeders, the management's different. Your people have to learn how to manage those systems, okay? And so it still takes a lot of people to run a system. It's just different people. Now, instead of having a lot of people out on the farm that are hand throwing feed, you have a lot of people in the office sitting behind big monitors with multiple streams of data managing these systems. You still have to have people out there on the farm looking at stuff. You still have to have somebody feeding it, filling those feeders, doing maintenance on those feeders. So your workforce does have to change in how you're doing things. Bottom line, as I said, whatever you can do to increase the number of feedings, that's typically been a benefit for our shrimp farmers. And with that, I will recognize I have a big lab with lots of students. I don't do this work by myself. I've got 15 to 20 students behind me that are running these trials. And then, of course, nothing would be done without them. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for their time and their patience. I've given you my email. If anybody has questions or needs additional assistance, you're welcome to drop me an email. David, I'll turn things back over to you.
With that, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. We appreciate everyone's time, particularly yours, Alan. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise with you. And I learned something new every time I see one of your presentations. This time it was that shrimp can't read. So that was great information, and we appreciate it. And folks, keep an eye on your email boxes for our next presentation. Not sure when that will be, but it will probably be in the next month or so. So we appreciate it. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you.